This is the Headless Valley, and it might just be one of the most creepy places in the world, because despite being an untouched part of Canadian wilderness, a valley that a lot of people want to visit at least once in their life, many others are terrified to even step one foot inside of it. And for good reason. The valley is believed to be cursed, and dozens of deaths and disappearances that happened here only add fuel to that fire. So what's the story here? What's hiding inside the massive cliffs and deep waters of this valley? And why is so much of it locked off to the general public these days? Night fam, these are the scary events of the Headless Valley. As I've just told you, there are many disappearances and gruesome deaths tied to the Headless Valley. Like Martin Jorgensen, who was found decapitated among the burned ruins of his cabin. Or even Annie Laferte, whose disappearance sparked many theories. But we'll get to all of them soon enough. You might be asking yourself, with a name as sinister as Headless Valley, why would anyone ever go in here? Well, there's one simple reason. Gold. And lots of it. See, the cliffs surrounding the Nahanni River are full of gold and have been a hotspot for miners since the early 20th century. People like Frank and Willie MacLeod, who went missing for 2 years after entering the valley. Now, they'd gone into it in search of gold, believing they'd make their fortune there. But they were never heard from again. For 2 years, their brother Charlie was completely in the dark, growing more and more worried as to the fate of his brothers. And when he finally did decide to find the truth out for himself, he rounded up 4 other men and descended down the river that ran through the valley. From the very beginning, the very first step they made into the valley, they felt as if they were being watched. As if there was something lurking in the tall cliffs and dark caves that surrounded them. And whatever it was, it got to Charlie's brothers first. As soon as the group emerged into wider, slower waters, they found the brothers' camp. And among the torn clothing and the smell of decaying flesh, they found 2 headless bodies. Hiya. Before we go back to the video, if you could please do me a favor and subscribe to After Nightfall right now, I would appreciate it. We are currently at 17,000 subscribers and we want to reach 100K by the end of the year. So if you appreciate what we do and you agree with some of the people who comment that After Nightfall is one of the most underrated channels on YouTube, then help us out, get us up in the algorithm and subscribe right now. Thank you so much. The corpses were at this point heavily decomposing. But thanks to their personal belongings, Charlie easily identified them as his brothers. On one of the trees were carved the words, "We found a good prospect here." So it was clear. The MacLeod brothers did find a lot of gold in the valley, but none of it could be found in their camp, or anywhere near the area they were staying in. What happened to it? And more importantly, what could have left the 2 men in such a brutal state? Whatever killed the 2 brothers must have done it recently, and chances were it was still lurking in the area when Charlie and his group arrived. Many of those people never returned, and if they did, instead of fortunes and gold, they returned with haunting stories to tell. Every year, gold miners would head into the valley, and every year a few new creepy legends would come out about it. Now, I've touched on these before. Martin Jorgensen, who took his boat down the river with the same idea the MacLeod brothers had. But he was found the following year decapitated, and his cabin burned to the ground. Yet, the autopsy revealed he was already dead by the time the cabin was in flames. And then we have a story of John O'Brien, who was a hunter and was found frozen, sitting next to his campfire with matches still in his hand. To this day, it's believed that he has frozen to death, sitting next to a fire. But wait, something doesn't add up here. And how did John, who had years of experience behind him as a hunter and more than enough supplies and warm clothes to survive the harsh weather, end up almost frozen in time? And worse, the last group to go missing in Headless Valley were European prospectors in the early 60s, and their fate, we can imagine, was just as gruesome and chilling as the others. Now, you might write these stories off as just coincidences or unfortunate deaths due to the local wildlife or environment, but this isn't the case. These killings are not typical for any animal, and that's not to mention just how strange many of these deaths are. And as for any people living along the Nahanni River, well, unlike the rest of the Canadian wilderness, the Nahanni Valley was always almost completely uninhabited. For decades, the native tribes that tried to settle here were always driven out. They carried with them stories of giant white wolves or pale demonic creatures stalking the shores of the river at night. And the most terrifying thing is, they weren't the only ones who spotted these creatures. Let's talk about Annie. Annie was just an ordinary girl spending a night in the cold wilderness of the valley with her group. But during the night, as the rest of the camp settled in for sleep, Annie disappeared without a trace. Stories began to spread quickly of how she was seen that night completely naked, clawing her way up the cliffside, that her face had this unhuman look, as if she'd been taken over by some animalistic spirit. As I've already told you, the description of Annie matches chillingly well to these pale demons. So, what's going on here, Nightfam? Obviously, as with all these stories, we don't really know for certain. Yes, many people died there, and there's many creepy legends coming from there. Today, Headless Valley is almost unreachable. Not only is there no direct way to reach the valley, with the only option being extremely long and grueling hikes, but the area itself is still considered to be cursed, even a century after the first stories came to light. And on top of that, vast areas of Nahanni have been locked off. Now, this was allegedly to preserve the wilderness and nature, but I can't help but question if this might be due to whatever it is that stalks the cliffs and woods of the Headless Valley. Because if we take anything from all of these creepy stories about the Nahanni Valley, it's that there really is something there. Something that had to have killed the MacLeod brothers. Something that must have burned Martin Jurgensen and his cabin, and something that must have taken over Anne's body. And whatever it is, chances are it's still prowling the beautiful valley, lurking in the shadows of its caves, and waiting for the next curious soul to become its headless prey.